Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is...
I'm Sarah Arnold. I'm an associate professor at Maynooth University and I'm the head of Department of Media Studies, and that's in Ireland.
Prof. Arnold of Ireland. Thank you very much for being here today. I'm excited about it. So is the podcat, who is licking rather than biting, whereas when we were talking before recording, he was biting. But then you tucked your hair back, and that
I hid my lovely hair, yeah. Then suddenly the
you
cat
had
had
to hide
settled.
your lovely hair, and that pacified him. His jealousy is now under control, isn't it? So, Prof, I wanted to start by asking you what is my standard query, namely if you could share with us what's currently impeding, preoccupying, interesting, dynamizing you. What's going on for Prof. Sarah?
So at the moment, I have a number of research projects underway, and my research topic in the last probably 15 to 20 years has usually been women and gender. And what's interesting or preoccupying and certainly challenging me at the moment is in Ireland, there's been a rise of kind of anti-gender sentiment. And that happens at the kind of level of the far right, where there's this been kind of pushback against women's rights, pushback against, I suppose, kind of efforts to encourage gender equality. But it's also kind of happening in ordinary culture, where, for example, I'm working on school projects at the moment where there's just this casual misogyny. And so 20 years ago, I was very positive about the kind of potential of gender equality and of diversity. Nowadays, I'm a little bit more cautious about it. And I think that's going to be it's one of the challenges now. And it's certainly going to be one of the challenges over the coming years is we're fighting something that felt like it was achieved or close to being achieved a number of years ago. And obviously there's been a kind of a pushback against that.
That's really interesting, Prof, because for many of us who are pretty ignorant of Ireland, we would think of it as having been very regressive on gender issues in the past, in part thanks to the you-know-which church, but as having come an incredible distance in the fairly recent past in terms of queer rights, abortion rights, and so on, and have seen it as a beacon of liberal tolerance by contrast with Britain, until just recently this horrific anti-immigrant sentiment that comes from a place that has itself rather benefited from having the opportunity to move to other places when necessary. But what you're saying is that actually 20 years ago, you saw things as being better, or at least on the cusp of improvement, and now you can see a regression. Is that right?
Yeah, there's been much more of an acceptance of, again, this kind of underlying casual misogyny of enough of that, and that's in kind of public discourse as well. And so what I would have seen is that, yeah, there was a kind of sense in which the Catholic Church, let's name and shame the Catholic Church, is the kind of the main instigator and certainly kind of the kind of key figures in child abuse, in the repression of women, putting women into kind of mother and baby homes if they got pregnant and were unmarried. So there was this kind of accepted high-level misogyny that was kind of, I suppose, critiqued then from the 1990s onwards. Then we were in Ireland giving ourselves great pats on the back for things like, gay marriage rights, for, the Repeal the Eighth movement, which led to introduction, legalization of abortion. I would not be surprised if we started to see very significant pushback against those in the coming years. It's happened. We've looked at it and seen it in the States. It could very easily happen here as well. And the more, I suppose, there's a kind of a bit of an alignment between the economic pressures that people are facing in terms of, for example, we've got this ongoing housing crisis that is fairly manufactured. It is basically state inaction that has led to this. And then the people that are being blamed and the kind of groups that are being blamed are exactly those groups are the most vulnerable. So, for example, people who are seeking asylum in Ireland, people who are facing poverty are the groups that are kind of getting the blame for this. So there's been very little done to counter this. And in fact, what we see is as the economic crisis continues, the kind of, I suppose, kind of blaming of other groups of people and the intolerance towards groups of people, particularly minority groups, is increasing as well.
So many of us have held up Mary Robinson as our ideal politician, again, out of ignorance, but in terms of her international standing and her cosmopolitanism, she's been a sort of heroic figure for lots of us. But I guess this is a time when you need some more Mary Robinsons to have power and authority. Would that be right?
Yeah, that's right. And I think that, again, sometimes we feel, I don't think this is a particularly Irish thing, I think this is internationally, that if we have one good success in terms of, let's say, the gaining of rights, so one good successful figure, then that is suddenly, we can put that to bed now. That's done. We've had a female leader. That's enough. Let's go back to the kind of the male leadership, which we're all very comfortable with.
Right.
So sometimes those kind of pioneers, kind of mask the fact that nothing has actually fundamentally changed.
You've had a gay South Asian Taoiseach, pardon the pronunciation, but now it's back to business as usual, for example. Yeah?
That's right, yeah. And actually, at the very time that we had a gay South Asian Taoiseach, we've seen the kind of biggest rise in anti-immigrant sentiment and a kind of a growing homophobia as well.
Right, Leo Varadkar. So, and what you're saying is that this isn't just about the far right and its foundational misogyny. There is no far right without misogyny. This is much more common. This is something that you're saying is in a sense, the bipartisan or multi-partisan common culture, this misogyny.
Yeah, and to give you an example of that, so I do a lot of research on women working in creative industries, so particularly kind of audiovisual industries, broadcasting. And one of the attitudes that persists is for women to say there is no sexism in the creative industries. So despite the fact that there are much fewer women, that their careers are much shorter, that they have a lot of challenges and difficulties in balancing, for example, motherhood and creative work, that they would say that if I haven't seen it, it doesn't exist. And if you talk to them and say, well, what about the fact that, let's say, there's a kind of a siloing of women into roles that are less paid, roles that have less kind of access to leadership and power, they would say that that's probably women's choice. So there's still that kind of attitude of women need to stop really talking about this because it's making our lives difficult in creative work. And I was speaking to some people who were saying that, and again, I was kind of cautious about using this in the research because I thought it's such a controversial thing to say. But they had said that the funding schemes that are dedicated to encouraging women into creative leadership roles, so for example, screenwriting, directing, in Ireland, there's kind of a state fund for that provided by Screen Ireland, that these shouldn't exist because it's unfair to men. And to hear that come from women when actually there's so few women in leadership roles in cultural production is quite shocking.
Prof, you've no idea how we suffer.
I know. You don't have your kind of, full quota of 100% of cultural production, therefore more is needed. Yeah.
I think you put that very, very well. I guess that's interesting. This is suggesting that those women who've managed to get somewhere in these industries have felt as though they can't use the F word, feminism, and they can't act in feminist ways. And they're actually asking the rest of you who are outside the boat not to talk about it. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And actually, I'm working on another project which is called Women in Focus. And it's to do, we're trying to kind of put a value on women's cultural production, for example, home movie making, amateur filmmaking. And as we were bringing this out into smaller organizations and communities to talk about how this is a kind of a feminist project, we were told, please don't use the word feminism. It'll scare people away. And so, yeah. And the same within schools when we were kind of interviewing for another project, school children about their attitudes towards gender and their kind of understanding of gender. Feminism never once came up as a gender topic. No, not one student ever mentioned the word feminism. And in fact, when we kind of approached them about it, it didn't really seem relevant. There wasn't really that much engagement with it. So that would be, again, those kind of concerns about feminism is seen as an achieved project. Please stop going on about it now.
Yeah. So you'd attribute that to this tendency more generally in Irish society and culture to the sense that now that there is the right to abortion, now there is this exposure of the horrors of Catholic Church and school abuses, now that there is marriage equality, just shut up and sit down?
Yeah. So yeah, for women, it's kind of like you've reached equality, so enough of that. And then at the same time, at the very same time, there's been this anti-trans backlash, this total anti-trans rhetoric, where it's seen as, this kind of narrative of there's two genders, so please stop, complicating things, and a resistance to it, for example, in teaching in schools. So there's this duality where the rights are already there, but we don't want these people getting rights.
One of the things that happens here in Spain very much, and the same in France, is that some of the tendencies you've identified, especially anti-trans sentiment, but also anti-refugee sentiment, is that this is seen as a product of a transnational right-wing movement, articulated in many cases through think tanks and other organizations. Sometimes it's done through not Catholic Christianity so much, though that's the case here in Spain, but often Pentecostal and other evangelical forms of Protestantism, dominated by the United States, often funded by the United States. And that's undoubtedly true, but that also, I think, as an analysis, misses out on homegrown bigotry, which is pretty profound in these places, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I suppose, an era of great change. I mean, all eras are of great change, but in an era where there's kind of a quite visible great change, there's a kind of a tendency to resist anything that's seen as change, regardless of whether it's good or bad change. So, for example, the focus on trans rights and the kind of resistance and the backlash to that often comes from a position of lack of understanding. So the very kind of people who are against it have and I've spoken to, I'm from rural Ireland, and I would encounter a lot of these views quite often. And it's in this very kind of casual, what seems like an uninvested way. It's like, well, I just think that it's a bit kind of overblown, and why do these people keep going on about it? Like, really, there are only two genders. And if you ask, have you spoken to a trans person about that? Well, no. Where am I going to meet a trans person? It's like, well, that's probably the starting point of any opinion you might have, is to first of all speak to people who have that experience. But there's this kind of sense in which it's too much change all at once, whether it's immigrants or trans rights or anything like that. It just, I always kind of say it's the no until it's a yes. It's just no to change until there's this kind of convincing towards a yes. But I suppose activists especially get tired of having to do the convincing of, can I have the same rights as anybody else?
Pardon me. And some of this sentiment, this anti-immigrant sentiment in particular, you're identifying as articulated to economic and specifically housing problems?
Yeah, I mean, some of it would arise from that, and it's certainly been used as an excuse. So there's been, probably since the Celtic Tiger, for a few years, there was, the economic crash. Very quickly after that, by around 2012, suddenly property became very expensive again. The housing market became very difficult to access. There's an unbelievable shortage of rental houses and houses to buy. And therefore, there seems to be kind of pressure. There's the highest level of homelessness and housing, like a lack of housing that we've had in our recent history. And so what happens, or what's emerged out of that, probably under the influence again of these foreign actors, kind of US-based kind of anti-immigrant rhetoric, is that has not been targeted, or the anger about the housing crisis not being targeted at the government, who are not providing enough housing, which is their role, their duty and responsibility, but they're targeting towards other people who are also vulnerable in that same situation. So people who are coming from outside. So whether that's people who already are inherently racist finding an excuse, but there is a genuine kind of feeling of crisis in those people as well. And it's very easy then to target other people who are seen as competing for that housing. So that's kind of allowed this, it's a kind of, I suppose, normalized racism is in a way, because it's linked to this very recognized social issue, which is housing.
And Prof, I wonder if I could ask you a pedagogic question, which is to inquire what sorts of attitudes in terms of misogyny and so on you're experiencing in the classroom with your students. Are you seeing over time a change of attitudes in gender politics?
Yeah, I think that once upon a time, let's say 5 or 6 years ago, I would have been very, very comfortable in the kind of way in which I approached teaching, for example, gender in the media. These days, I feel like I do need to kind of almost provide a rationale for it. And as an example of that, I do a survey of the students and graduates from our programs. So we would kind of survey them just on their graduate destinations, on their attitudes to media work. Sometimes we talk to them about their experience of gender in the workplace. Have they ever, experienced kind of discrimination? And we've had a few, like in some of those responses, there's a small but very, very vocal minority who will say that basically, stop going on about this. I don't believe in any of this. I don't believe that there's discrimination. I think it's overblown. So there's this kind of sudden emergence of this, not a kind of a look, I'm just not interested in that, but a very active resistance and opposition to the idea of gender discrimination. So this reinforcement of this idea of meritocracy, that I don't want a woman, or I don't want a trans person, or I don't want somebody who's ethnically non-Irish getting a job ahead of me, as though the person who's the me has all of the skill and talent in the world that is suddenly being undermined by these other kind of groups, minority groups. So there's a kind of a rise in that notion of meritocracy, but in a very aggressive way, in the sense that other people are taking the roles that I by right should have. And that's the attitude in terms of media work and their attitudes to media work. They would, and what I'm saying I'm probably talking about white ethnically Irish students would sometimes see women, non-ethnically Irish, other groups as in competition for the work that should by rights be theirs.
And there are two representational questions here, at least. One is representation occupationally that you've just mentioned. The other is representation textually. Do you find, and do your colleagues find, resistance in the classroom to talking about how come that girl's in a bikini? How come that woman's body is used to sell this product, when those very obvious, powerful instances of sexism are on display and you teach about them, you mention them. Are you getting kickback there?
I think they're at the moment when I teach representation, they're much more attuned to recognizing gender stereotypes. So there is a kind of sense in which they can understand it at that level, that if there is a woman who's being hypersexualized and there's a man who's being, let's say, kind of hypermasculinized, that these are stereotypes. So they would have the kind of vocabulary by which they could point that out, but at the same time would possibly kind of lean back into stereotypes when it's outside of the representational context. So as an example of that, and this is not necessarily where I work now, but I remember when I worked in the UK and I worked teaching, let's say, audiovisual practice, we might be doing film production. If you were to ask groups to self-select into production roles, inevitably they would gender themselves. So men would take the leadership roles, women would act as the producers, they would, do the script writing, they would do all of these roles that were non-leadership roles, really. And so you would kind of see that although they kind of had this recognition of the vocabulary of gender stereotyping in cultural products, they wouldn't necessarily put that into practice in terms of taking on more kind of assertive roles or like being more collaborative in their practice. And I suppose where I really saw it, where I was really concerned about, I suppose, kind of the level of the growing sexism was in secondary school students. So when we undertook, as part of this Gemini project, which is looking at gender mainstreaming in secondary schools. So what we're doing is using media texts like serial drama to get students to talk about gender stereotypes, to understand, gender equality. And when we did focus groups and when we spoke to and interviewed teachers, what was really, really apparent was that teachers are, first of all, frightened themselves about teaching these topics. They're frightened about talking about, for example, what is a trans person? What is gender? They are very, very nervous because they're very aware They perceive that there is a backlash waiting to happen. They perceive that there's resistance to it. And even recently, in the last couple of days, in Ireland, gender education is quite poor at secondary school level. There isn't dedicated examinable subjects, really. And there was a subject that's proposed to be taught from 2027, which introduces, conversations and discussions around pornography, around gender-based violence. And the teaching unions have come out and say, we need training. These are such sensitive topics. And in the kind of cultural environment that we're in, the kind of the social environment that we're in, we cannot do this without training. And so they've been kind of saying that there is no training to provide this, and that these are really kind of difficult topics to teach in Ireland at the moment. And they were kind of right in that way that, there's been so many controversies about it, that everybody needs to be trained to the same level to teach it in the same way. So schools, I would see, as whatever about universities, secondary schools.
Yeah.
They're really concerned, particularly about kind of boys' behaviour. So every single teacher we interviewed mentioned Andrew Tate as being a big influence on male students. And yeah.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't laugh. It's just that I find him and his dickhead brother and Jordan Peterson and Donald Trump as examples of this kind of hegemonic masculinity. At one level, absolutely frightening and terrifying. At another level, they're laughable because they're so transparently stupid and ignorant. You know what I mean? So I have this mixture of horror and terror and a sort of arrogant dismissal of them, right?
Yeah, and I'm the same. Sometimes if you kind of read some of the, just the discourse and the rhetoric, of this, particularly Andrew Tate, it's so comical. It's so over the top.
Yeah.
But it appeals to a very young masculine mindset, a very young male mindset. The idea of having power, you have the inevitable right to power, everybody else should be powerless in the face of you, you should dominate, is probably attractive to a kind of an immature mindset.
Excuse me, Prof, I'm just going to have some cough mixture. Not very professional, but,
Go ahead, I've got my coffee here as well, so I'll join you.
I think your coffee might taste better than something called Pranarom. Anyway, I wanted to go back to something else, if I could, that you mentioned en passant at the beginning, which is women's amateur film. This sounds incredibly interesting to me, both historically and in a contemporary context. So is that's research that's ongoing, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And you're going to get me out of my rant now, so... Okay, rant finished. Let's move into more positive space.
We're now into happy territory. Is that right?
We are. I've really enjoyed this project. And amateur film is probably not something I would have had a huge amount of interest in 10 years ago. And I'm really embarrassed to say this is one of these things that haunts me. When sometimes say, what did you ever say that now haunts you to this day? And this is one of the things, which was maybe actually even more, maybe 20 years ago. I remember, I can't remember which academic, but an academic in Ireland who was trying to encourage people, when I was doing my PhD, trying to encourage people to get involved in kind of tracking and tracing amateur film in Ireland. And I thought in my head, and I think I said it to somebody, who'd be interested in that? And then roll on around 15 to 20 years, it's exactly me who's interested in that. So I have the guilt and shame kind of alleviated by the fact that I'm now working with amateur film in Ireland. But it's just been really, really interesting and a great project. And the project basically, there was two projects, one which is called Women in Focus, which is now being extended into something called Empowering Archives. And the kind of aim of the projects were to figure out a way of better representing, recognising and showcasing women's amateur work, because it's undervalued. Amateur work is undervalued anyway, in comparison, in the larger film canon. And then women's production and women's work is also undervalued in terms of film scholarship. So working with the UK team, so Keith Johnson, Paul Fritz, Zoe Viney Burgess over in the UK and the East Anglia Film Archive and the Irish Film Archive in Ireland, and Caroline Madden, another postdoctoral researcher, we started to investigate and look at what films and collections are already of women's amateur filmmaking are already held in these individual archives in Ireland and the UK. And then looking at, well, why are they not better represented? What's going on? And the way in which we're looking at it is when these films come into the archive, are the women's names, for example, actually mentioned anywhere in the data that comes into the archive? Quite often, no. So you would never know that they're there unless you did some kind of historical research. And then what happens in the production of amateur film metadata that further kind of obscures the fact that they might have been involved? And so we're looking at all of these ways in which archival practices could start to kind of introduce mechanisms by which they could foreground this work as women's work. And then kind of, for example, things like digitization, putting them up on iPlayers, creating kind of other records somewhere else online, for example, the amateur movie database, so that there is kind of a recognition and a valuing of the work. So it's been really, really fascinating to look at collections. So in Ireland, we were in the Irish Film Archive. What we've tended to look at is a lot of, individual family collections or individual women's collections. And that could be home movies, animated film and so on. And in the UK, they were looking mostly at a very, very large collection of films, which is the Institute of Amateur Cinematographers. And they were looking at women's work within that. And some of the differences were that in the UK, they would have things like credits on the film. So you might have mention of women here and there because there would be kind of title credits at the end of the film or at the start of the film. Whereas in Ireland, you wouldn't. You might have a family collection and you have to watch the films to see, oh yeah, so the husband is in the film. So who's actually recording the film of the husband and the children? Who's the other person there with the family? It's the mother. So let's kind of introduce her name into the metadata and make sure that she's kind of recognized as one of the filmmakers.
Right.
Yeah. So we've been really lucky in that we've come across some really amazing collections. We discovered one particular collection in Ireland, which was by a filmmaker, a woman called Flora Kerrigan, who'd been operating in the early 1960s, making these kind of 2D animations, really, and some 3D animations, stop motion animations, really kind of adult themes. So there was a kind of a queer sensibility about the films. There was a real kind of anti-war messaging in these short animations that nobody really knew about. It was only by absolute chance that we found her name in a UK newspaper or magazine. It was handed to me. I found the sister and I went up to the sister's house up in Roscommon and I said, this sister was a filmmaker. The woman, Flora Kerrigan, is still alive, but she's dementia at the moment. And then they just took out of the corner, they said, oh yeah, she made, and they had this box of films and they just said, here are the box of films that she made that haven't been really viewed, that hadn't been digitized, that had kind of been forgotten. So it was really amazing to kind of get those films into the archive. And what that's allowed us to do is there was this kind of, in the history of Irish animation, there was this gap, really. So there was this idea that there was the 1930s, these brothers, the Horgan brothers, had made some animated film, and then nothing really happens up until the 1950s and 60s when there's some state-level amateur film, and then we see the establishment of these bigger animation companies, Cartoon Saloon and so on. So the 1940s and 50s were this kind of zone of nothing really happened. And so by looking at this collection, we've been able to say, not only is Flora Kerrigan doing lots of really interesting films, exhibiting them, showing them, but also she was supported by one of these Horgan brothers. They put on the exhibition for her, one of her early exhibitions. So there's this kind of retelling of the history of animation through the insertion of women into that as well. So that's been a real nice achievement, is to say that we can go back and revise these histories and we can kind of tell them in a different way. And we can include women's work within that. Like, history is not this one narrative that needs to stay a certain way. You can just take particular lenses on it and find new information and just really kind of upend that narrative. And I've been thinking about this with my colleague Caroline Madden as well recently in terms of Irish production history. So this idea that there wasn't really an Indigenous Irish film industry until it kind of globalized. It's like, well, yeah, there wasn't an industry, but there was certainly Irish filmmaking, and there was lots of it. And if we stop focusing on this kind of commercialized industry lens as the way in which film history happens, and we look at cultural production and creative, cultural heritage and audiovisual filmmaking of all different forms, there's this really rich tradition of community filmmaking, amateur filmmaking, home movie making. There is a huge film history there, but it's just not the commercialized one, the capitalist one. So it's kind of nice to be able to kind of take these different lenses onto film history.
Wonderful. And speaking of history and finding archives and so on, I wonder if, sorry, the podcast is nuzzling.
I need to put away my hair again, do I? Is it getting violent?
I don't know, or there are one or two books behind you that have pink or orange or red covers. Maybe he's responding to those. He's not actually attacking me. He's just making sure that he gets my affection. Don't worry, I'm not stressing that I'm giving you affection, but you know what I mean. Maybe we should call it attention. Anyway, Prof, getting on to this theme of histories, you brought out a now renowned book a few years ago on gender and early television. And television is very hard to research historically because it was, like home movies in certain ways, perhaps even more so, thought of by the industry as ephemeral in a way that they often didn't think of cinema. So could you tell us a wee bit about that book, which I must admit, I've read a lot of your work, but I don't have a copy of that, so I haven't read it. So you're also informing me. But if you could tell us a wee bit about that volume, that would be really great.
Yeah, so the Gender and Early Television, and I can't even remember the full title of it. It's something like Emerging Television. Anyway, but it is, it's really focused on early television in the US and in Britain, really. So in England.
Hang on. Gender and Early Television, Mapping Women's Role in Emerging US and British Media, 1850 to 1950.
And it's really 1950s, I should have put in there. But yeah, that's a lengthy title, isn't it? That gets enough words. I've been kind of trained well in the kind of publishing, anything that people might search up. So it is, it's very focused on US and UK. And looking at, I mean, the way that book started, it's probably 10 years ago, even more, where I had this notion that I was going to particularly look at new platforms of television and the way in which women either kind of have access to it or not. And so the starting position was that, or my starting position was that the more kind of technologically advanced, the more media production there is, the more women can find their way into these kind of media roles and work and shape them. And in fact, that I quickly discovered that was not the case. In fact, probably what we see is when a new media arises in the experimental stage, whether that's print, television, film, radio, whatever it might be, that there is lots of opportunity for all these different stakeholders to get involved and to be part of that process. And when it gets institutionalized and when it becomes kind of commercialized, that's when you see opportunities become limited, when you start to see roles and hierarchies. So I started to look at early television and see that I had thought that there would be very few women working in early television. So I was just trying to find out, were there any at all? And in fact, there was loads of them. So there was real opportunities there for women to come in because television was considered less than radio. It was such a long time for it to develop. There'd been the promise of television all of the time. Since the 1800s, there'd been this idea that, we've had the telegraph, we've had the telegram, we now have radio. Inevitably, there's going to be kind of visual. But it was like what we have VR today. It was just constantly stalling and never really getting anywhere. So radio had become established. That was where the kind of big business was. Television was still this thing that was considered maybe a bit of a kind of a technological dead end. So when they were experimenting with it in the BBC in the 1930s and over in the States as well, the likes of NBC, it wasn't really a place where people wanted to go to establish their careers. It was a place to kind of figure out what can we do with this. So there was lots more capacity for women to go in there and to kind of be part of the teams and leading the teams that were developing it and developing the kind of form of it. So in the BBC, you see the likes of Mary Adams, who was working in the 1930s in the experimental stage, making lots of different she'd come from radio and she was making all these kind of science, cultural programs, real kind of special interest art programs. And was kind of doing it at a very advanced level. So kind of basically created the template for kind of factual programming in UK television. But in the UK, by the 1930s, obviously with the kind of start of the war, they suspended television. So television service ends, comes back in the late 1940s, I think it's 1947. And by that stage, there's more of an investment in it. It's seen as potentially quite lucrative. And you start to see, again, these kind of hierarchies be introduced. So there's less women recruited into it. You see lots more kind of transfer of men from radio into it. And you start to see a decline in the number of women working in it, to the extent that women were kind of kept outside of things like presenting the news. So you start to see like a real siloing and a real kind of segregation of the roles happen in the 1950s. You have women's programming, and then you have programming. So every other program is default male, and then there's that kind of special category of programming for women. So they have their kind of time slot in the morning. And something similar happens over in the over in the US. In the US, there was, during the war, there was lots more opportunities for women to kind of go in and to form kind of experimental stations. So you had lots more kind of individual stations that I'd looked at. In particular, there was a station, WBKB in Chicago. And in order to retain their station license, as kind of more and more men went to war, they recruited in women to keep the production going, because if you weren't producing, you weren't going to sustain your license. So they got women in as this kind of core technical production team who were making and experimenting with all these different ways of, again, creating news programming, magazine programming, lifestyle and entertainment programming, and really did a fantastic job of it. And by then, the end of the war, what starts to happen is they don't necessarily get kicked out, but there's many more men brought back into production. And then again, you start to see that women's access to leadership roles, it becomes harder for them. More men are in leadership roles. And so a lot of the women who've been working there kind of left and went into other creative roles. But it's a good kind of microcosm of how the industries work, is that lots of opportunities in the early stages, professionalizes, becomes a bit more serious, and then there's less opportunities. And I think that kind of ties into, and I don't really talk about this as much in the book, but it was something that I kind of keep coming back to, is that there's this kind of sense of distrust in women's abilities, a distrust in them being powerful and being leaders and having competencies. So there's this constant kind of sense of, if you were to employ a woman, it's a risky thing to undertake. If you employ a woman, like they might go on maternity leave, they might be more collaborative and not necessarily kind of be able to lead men, or men cannot be led by women. And it's always put down to a woman's problem rather than a problem to do with the structure of work or the contours of work. So work is fine. The way in which we organize work is fine. It's the women who are just not really adapting to that, or whose bodies don't adapt to that. And I think we're at the same stage today, like in our current workplaces. That's no different today, that women have to, I hate the phrase, but it's, the Sheryl Sandberg, lean in and adapt to the circumstances, because this is just the way things are. I was looking at how things become the way things are, and how women kind of, the processes by which women get excluded. So that's a very lengthy summary.
No, thank you. And I do hope I managed to get hold of a copy, because I think that's incredibly interesting and important. I mean, if you look at Hollywood in the teens and early 20s, so much screenwriting is done by women, but it's quite a female-dominated profession, until sound comes and suddenly all the boys who are Broadway dramatists come across the country, and it becomes a gendered profession in a different way. And of course, in addition to these issues of hierarchy you raise, there are also questions of remuneration.
Yeah. As
these things get better paid, men get more interested in being involved in them, and then elbow women out, right?
Yeah, and it's a really interesting way in which things happen, and the kind of the remuneration and the prestige of a role are kind of key to that. And I was speaking to, this is recent enough, I was speaking to somebody who works in Irish language broadcasting, and they were explaining, we were talking about the differences, the same role in English language programming in Ireland, like, so let's say kind of radio production versus Irish language radio production. And she'd explained to me that a role that is called broadcast coordinator in English language, and is quite well paid. In the Irish, and is undertaken largely by men. In Irish language, is called broadcast secretary, and is undertaken by women, and there is less pay, and it is an identical role. And so it's quite interesting that the role title, secretary, is it the role title and the remuneration that encourage more women in, or is that women are undervalued and therefore if they're working in Irish language broadcasting, which there are more women working in Irish language broadcasting, the work they do is just less valued and it's got less prestige. So it's a good comparison to be able to say, what is the difference? The difference is the word secretary and everything. And the difference is that more women do it in the Irish language. Therefore, the pay is less, the kind of conditions are worse and so on.
You mentioned the Midwest, Chicago. An article of yours that I really appreciated is about Detroit. And this, I guess, returns to the question of the way in which the political economic gets reflected in textual representation, and the way in which Detroit, which is really Rust Belt central, the United States, and has gone through terrible urban decay and hell, albeit always resisting and with all kinds of inventive and exciting projects like urban gardeners and so on, is very striking. And I mean, there are plenty of places in North America that betray the traces of the same Rust Belt difficulties. But your article on that really interested me because of this, as I say, this way of looking at the representation of political economic distress. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, not just the article itself, but what you were trying to get at, as it were.
Yeah, I think what I've noticed, and I suppose Detroit is a good international example of that, but it occurs at a very local level as well, whereby, like, where I live right now is kind of a small rural town, Midlands, Ireland, which is kind of slightly deindustrialized in some ways, or had been kind of at its industrial heyday back in the 1970s. It no longer is so. And there have been a lot of kind of industry, a lot of institutions. And near where I live, there's an old psychiatric hospital. Now, nobody loves an old psychiatric hospital more than me, but I'm very conscious of the fact that what we're doing in this, particularly in terms of kind of photography and filmmaking, is you're romanticizing something that is full of trauma. And you're kind of trying to turn a beautifying lens onto something without really kind of recognizing that there are really difficult circumstances here. And if you're kind of holding it in this moment of ruinistic pleasure, you are not helping it to move on, to kind of to do something else. And so it's like taking pictures, like there's a load of documentaries you find on Netflix that are about, let's say kind of crack epidemic or about the kind of fentanyl epidemic in the States. And again, you see these long lingering shots of, kind of graffitied walls, homeless people sleeping. And they're done in this kind of high definition, slow motion, kind of soft lens, soft kind of focus way, which is not, it's kind of, again, taking this kind of classical beautifying aesthetic onto something that is really kind of, it's a really harsh, difficult thing that needs political action. And my worry would be that if you're holding it in this nostalgic moment of, look at how the past is, that's not the past, that's the present, and the present needs urgent action. And by you kind of turning it into this almost kind of ruined castle, you're kind of saying it's this relic of the past. So in the hospital that's local to me, like everybody kind of loves taking photos and wandering around it. That place needs to be redeveloped. It needs something to happen to it because it's just this place filled with kind of trauma. It's a kind of a ruin. It's really kind of, I don't see why we should kind of, I suppose my worry is that we just like ruins the way they are, and that kind of stops us turning it into anything positive. So with Detroit is a city that needs, a huge amount of investment. It needs for those ruins to be redeveloped. It needs for those ruins to be turned into something positive and usable, habitable. So why are we kind of romanticizing ruins? And I think, in Ireland today, there's a big, like I mentioned already, the economic crisis and the housing crisis. So there is this kind of program to start basically identifying all these places and, encouraging the redevelopment or turning into housing, so that these are not romantic spaces where we can look at and say, oh, look at the old factory there that's red brick and that's really beautiful and we can go and explore it. It's actually, that's housing that's not being used properly. It's a place that is just sitting there taking up space and kind of becoming dangerous, rather than something that, oh, well, let's take some kind of high definition HDR photographs of it and make it look really kind of atmospheric. So yeah, it is it's a bit of a polemic to say that all those people, and me included, taking these kind of wonderful photographs of these kind of places in their decaying form, are not being particularly good community actors.
Now, again, a bit of a leap of connection on my part, but the theme of trauma is something that's pretty important in what I think is your first book on motherhood and horror. And these are terms that are not often put together conceptually, it seems to me. But you've written a book about melodrama/horror and mothers. It's very compelling, and it finds you engaging with psychoanalysis on this occasion rather than the political economic you just mentioned. Could you tell us a wee bit about that volume?
Yeah, so that was my PhD project. And when I grew up in, I was a 1980s kid, so we were VHS, for the win, like all day, every day, just watching videotapes that we would rent out of the video rental store when they existed. And so I became fascinated with horror film. I really just loved, I don't know what it was I loved about it, but I just really loved it. And so when I came to do my PhD, I'd studied film studies. Horror film was probably a good setting. It was something I was very familiar with. I knew the kind of genre, I knew the tropes. And the focus on motherhood came just because it was one of these constant references in horror film. And I just started to notice when I wanted to look at women in horror film, it's like there's a huge number of mothers, good, bad, or indifferent, that it just seems to be this constant thematic. What happens with, what does she do? What impact has he had on the child? Is she successful or not? Does she sacrifice herself or not? And so the focus on motherhood then was a kind of way of trying to figure out what is going on. Because in the horror studies literature, there's a lot of focus on women, for example, the slasher film. There was a lot of focus on, kind of gender dynamics of the slasher and the way in which, there's a kind of, the slasher is the surrogate male, but a man doesn't want to see himself get hurt. The Carol Clover, men can't see men see traumatized, therefore it's easier for them to see a woman traumatized. That's why we have the slasher film. But there was something different going on in lots of the films that I was looking at, which was much more filled with pathos. And so in that kind of thinking about, these are really about mother-child bonds, or the breaking of those bonds and the consequence of it. It's like, that's a melodramatic theme. Really what I think, no more than Clover said, the slasher film is a way of men identifying with trauma, but not seeing it on a male body. I think the horror film is a way of people kind of identifying with kind of those moments of the breakage of the relationship, or that sense of satisfaction with the maternal relationship, but having it kind of housed in something that's a little bit more braver, the horror film, a little bit kind of harder. But really underneath it all, it kind of goes back to family dynamics. And lots of people have written about the horror film as a kind of a family genre. But I think the melodramatic element is that in the horror film, we're not necessarily looking to get frightened. We're looking to get a sense of security. And oftentimes the mother is that kind of point of security. So we see the trauma, we experience the trauma, and then we kind of want the restoration of that. So we want the mother to, and Nicole Kidman, I think she plays a mother in lots of horror films. It's always the kind of return to her kind of open arms, the kind of, everything is okay, even if we're in a kind of dire straits, it's all going to be fine. That's the kind of pinnacle of the horror film, not the fright, I think. And so there are lots of fright horror films, but I think there's lots of them as well that are about the kind of restoration of safety and comfort, and the mother is the kind of figure of that. So I think horror films are quite often directed at an imagined child audience, or put the audience in the position of being mothered, and then the mother is the kind of object of those films. So we kind of experience ourselves being mothered by the mother in those films. I think that's the kind of the work it's doing. And one of the good early examples that Barbara Creed uses is Psycho. So it is all about being mothered unsuccessfully, let's say, and in it we don't even see the mother. She is always invoked we see a skeleton at the end, but you know, she's invoked, she's referred to, we hear the voice that Norman Bates puts on for her, but in fact she doesn't get to tell her own story. You know, I think there's later versions in which we see her in her previous incarnation, but in that kind of seminal Psycho film, it is just the consequences of her mothering that we see on Norman Bates. And funnily enough, you mentioned psychoanalysis there. I remember the first thing I wanted to study was psychoanalysis. That was my kind of hope. I didn't end up doing it, but I went to film studies instead. But I remember it was my father, who's a GP, saying to me, he said, Sarah, if you do this and you become a psychoanalyst, you will just be listening to criminals blame their mother for all of their actions, and that will be your career. And in a way, I just kind of went back to that. I just did the same thing in film. I just watch films in which the mother is blamed for the monster figure. So yeah, I never escaped it. But yeah, I think you see that in a lot of horror films. So if you're a good mother, you'll dedicate yourself absolutely exclusively to the child, and you'll save them, and you won't work, or you'll work in a role that kind of sustains that motherhood. And if you're a bad mother, you won't be totally attentive to the child. You know, you'll ruin them, and it'll be all your fault, and you'll probably be a working mother, and you probably have your own interests, which are terrible to have, and therefore the child is going to be a monster, and it'll be your fault. And that's kind of the maternal horror film in a nutshell.
I love your dad.
I still remember him sitting down. I don't know if this is a kind of a invented memory I have, but I'm sitting down, it's just like, you'll be listening to criminals, petty criminals blame their mother for all of their actions, and that.
I love your memory. I love your memory of your dad. Then,
yeah.
So, Prof, one last question, if I may, and then after posing that, I'd like to invite you, as a means of bringing things to a conclusion, to add anything you want, and that might mean going back, as they say in baseball commentary, to something we've touched on, or it might be something entirely new. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine, yeah.
So my last question is about current motherhood project, and if you could share a bit of that story with us.
Yeah, so the motherhood project I've been involved in the last 3 years, it's just come to a close this June, that's passed, and it was really fantastic opportunity. It was led by scholars in Vilnius University, Uppsala University, and Maynooth University, which we collectively applied for funding through the EU, basically to kind of collaborate at a cross-institutional level to kind of support building capacity in motherhood research. So the project really has been motherhood scholars of all different disciplines and fields working together and finding out kind of ways of collaborating on narratives of motherhood in kind of popular culture across Europe. What's been really useful out of that, I was one of the researchers, there's probably 40 of us from medicine, social sciences, social policy, creative industries, literature, you know, all different fields, is to figure out that we are all interested in the same thematics, even if we approach them from entirely different disciplines. So, for example, we would have working groups on motherhood and work, and people from business studies, you know, marketing, literature, and so on, would all be kind of thinking about what are the contours of motherhood and work, what are the kind of key issues and challenges that mothers face in work. And as an example of some of the outputs of that, I was working with Lithuanian colleagues who had also researched women in audiovisual work, and myself and a colleague, Anne O'Brien, kind of compared some of our data sets where we had interviewed mothers about their experiences, about how they managed childcare, about, you know, whether they exited the industry or not. And we found that all of them faced juggles and struggles in both instances, like they all kind of report that. But in Ireland, mothers were much more able to approach an employer to say, look, we need to be flexible here or find ways of accommodating my schedules and my time. And in Lithuania, they were very reluctant to approach an employer to let them know that there was kind of challenges in them being able to kind of work and mother. And there was a kind of a sense in which that arose out of these different political systems that existed. So kind of post-communist Lithuania, where there was a kind of a sense of there being a really strong welfare system. It was much harder for women to say, well, despite this strong welfare system, I still need support. You know, it was seen as, well, why would you need support? There's all these kind of hours available for childcare, when in fact they're really hard to access. Whereas in Ireland, childcare is totally privatized. So it's much easier for women to say, look, I can't afford to get childcare. I need to be able to work from home for part-time because there's no childcare available, or it costs £1,000 a month or £1,200 a month. So the different political systems had led to same challenges, but different solutions to those challenges, and certainly kind of different levels of ability to find solutions. So that's been really kind of a nice way of being able to kind of get outside of my own, I suppose my own kind of sphere of influence. So I'd be kind of tend to look at Anglophone countries that are fairly neoliberalized, that have kind of similar cultural industry structures. And I don't want to take that as this is the way things are, because you go and you look at another nation state then that's outside of that and you realize, okay, there's something different going on. So it's been a really kind of valuable and useful exercise in figuring out and kind of going beyond it. Ireland creative industries literature tends to be kind of largely, we tend to look at UK, Australia, US as the kind of exemplars, when in fact we're a small nation. So it's better to compare the experience of motherhood with other kind of small nations as well to figure out, well, we're kind of, what are the commonalities here as well as with something like the UK. So the Motherhood Project has just been a very good collaborative exercise and in kind of creating all these relationships that otherwise we wouldn't have had. And motherhood studies is this really interesting space because it gets you outside of your discipline and it gets you kind of speaking and taking approaches, which I know interdisciplinary research is kind of well established at this stage, but sometimes we tend to go for the same interdisciplinary kind of, or the same disciplines kind of intersecting with each other. Whereas, talking to people who are working in social work is really, really kind of gives you insight into, for example, if I'm talking about regretting motherhood, what does that actually mean when you're talking to somebody who's dealing with people who are speaking about their regrets of motherhood versus when we're looking at a cinematic representation of that? Are the two doing the same thing? Are there differences? So in that respect, yeah, it's a really great project.
There can be no regrets of motherhood because it's the complete fulfillment of femininity.
I know. And as a non-mother, I am just, I've just missed out. But yeah, it's one of those interesting things because part of the Mother Project was looking at things like regretting motherhood, non-motherhood, like how do we even articulate, those are negative terms, they're kind of loaded with like non-motherhood is something that is outside of, beyond. So how do you kind of re-articulate it in a way it's funny that as a woman, you're always in a relationship to motherhood, even if you're not a motherhood, there is always that kind of, there's a paradigm of womanhood and motherhood is in there and you're in there too. So it's a strange one to try and negotiate.
But it does sound like a wonderful project. And I imagine you guys are going to have a series of publications coming out.
Yeah, that's right. So there's one coming out contributed to chapter 2, which is the Palgrave book on parenthood and popular culture. And that's out next year. And yeah, the article on Lithuania and Irish mothers in creative industries work is already out. I think it's feminist media studies. So there's, a lot of literature to come out of that. And it's ongoing as well. So anybody interested in motherhood studies to just look up either MotherNet, which is called mothernet.eu, or Motherhood Project at Maynooth University, because there's still lots of collaborations ongoing.
Wow, it sounds amazing. So, Prof, to conclude matters, I'm wondering if there are things that you'd like to say that, as I indicated before, may go back to matters we've touched on, or maybe entirely new.
Yeah, so I suppose in thinking about the massive rant I had at the start of the podcast, I suppose things are not that bad. And as much as I'm kind of, again, my eyes are kind of focused on some of the dangerous elements, the kind of social elements that are arising, there is still, like, I'm in Maynooth University, which is a very open, supportive, diverse, inclusive space with, lots of different kind of nationalities, people, gender expressions, religions, and so on. That is really kind of good exemplar of the kind of society that we would like to have. So I think that, we should see the good. So I kind of spoke about students as, some of the kind of concerns I would have. But obviously students are the kind of change agents. They are the ones who have been kind of leading in the advancements of rights, as well as, obviously we see some kind of problems elsewhere,
Yes.
but they've been really, really good at that. So I think that a call out to young people and students for being the ones who in the last 10 years have really kind of progressed things. And I think they need more support than ever. And they've been the ones that have created a much more tolerant, accommodating society than we've probably had before that.
No, great. And you've also fulfilled the remit of cultural studies, which is to have something optimistic at the end, right?
Here we go. Yeah, I was conscious of that. It's like finish it, keep it light, Sarah.
No, but in all seriousness, what you say is terrifically important. And I think student activism, as I've seen it in the last few years in many different contexts, is a real beacon.
Yeah, that's
So,
for sure. So there was a kind of a quiet period, which is probably maybe my generation, but now, yeah, the last couple of years has just been, it's been reassuring to see that. And it will be a good counter to, again, kind of rise of the far right. We will see, again, this more progression. So we'll end on that as a kind of happy before I actually end up circling back again.
Prof. Sarah Arnold, thank you so much for your time spent with us today. It's a great honor to have spoken with you.
And thank you. Thanks for the invitation.